What this basically is saying is that the administrator, now if the administrator isn't smart enough or doesn't know that they should or should not attend the meeting, then me as a board member will probably go ahead and we'll have another ordinance change, and we might have another administrator. So, you know, what you're saying basically, what you're trying to say basically is that our administrator doesn't know what they're doing, and that's not true.
That wasn't what I was thinking of, but I appreciate your response. My next question is in section B on financial management. Obviously, the entire section there has been removed since it works under the CFO. Now, of course, we don't have an independent CFO, but then I also look towards, I want to look towards Division 3 of Chapter 2, so Division 4, which pertains to the Chief Financial Officer on here, and that the Chief Financial Officer is also still recommended by the County Administrator and appointed or dismissed by the County Board Chairman with the advice and consent of the Board, and also is subject to control of the County Administration and supervised by the Chairman as it's laid out in duties. If we are eliminating this level of financial control, we still have other sections in here in which the Chairman has direct control over these departments. Are we going to amend, should we expect amendments to Division 4 as well as Division 2, Division 5 as well, in which the Chairman still has authority over these other departments and the other divisions?
I don't understand your question.
My question is this: outside of what we have amended here in Division 2, Divisions 4, Divisions 5, and parts of Division 6 also refer to the Chairman having supervisory authority over the CFO, the COO, which we don't have, by the way, as well as a few other areas, and I'm asking if we should be expecting changes to those as well.
That answer would have to come from the majority of the board. At this time, what is written down here is, to me, pretty self-explanatory. And
I simply asked the question because now we have two different areas of the ordinance that would govern a single person or department. One says they report to this group of bodies, another says they report or are supervised by another, and now we have a conflict.
I'm going to put a hold on this just for 1 second. Carla, you had your hand up, and would you like the opportunity to speak to that?
I want to speak to the controls. Thank you, Chairman. I just want to speak to the controls that you're questioning. I am the county administrator and the CFO, but I do not record any of the accounting transactions for the county. Molly and the finance department do that, and they report to me. I could not even go into the accounting system. I don't have access to make any entries. It's purely supervisory.
I'm not referring to you in particular, just your role in general, as there are now multiple parts of our ordinance that reflect different supervisory positions on it. But if there's one last thing, just so we save some time here, I want to get at. After looking over this, we don't have a CFO. Well, you are acting as CFO as well as administrator. We don't have a COO. Who is currently doing the role of our COO?
Carla.
Okay.
Not entirely.
No.
I'm
sorry, I was going to, Carla.
Not entirely. Some of the functions are performed by different departments, and then some are performed by myself.
Okay. The point I'm trying to get at here, besides the inconsistencies now within our ordinance, is that I've counted over, with these changes, there are now about 50 different items determined by ordinance, including the CFO work, the COO work, that we have now handing over to a county administrator. And while I am confident that our current administrator is capable in many of these areas, I remain concerned that this is a task list that is so deep and so expansive that 20 people simply cannot preside over it and provide proper accountability. I think the newspaper today did a great job going back to, say, 1986, when we went through 5 administrators in 9 years because they couldn't report to 28 different bosses, one of the reasons we committed the chairman position in the first place. Carla, I am fairly confident you're going to be able to do most of these. I just worry that you're not going to be burned out in a year and a half. And I also worry that the 20 of us here have no policy for how we are going to provide any level of oversight. we are creating a lot of power in a single office space, or single office that's a non-elected official, and we have nothing in here about how we are actually going to hold that person accountable. Lack of accountability, no matter what level of regard you hold someone into, is a recipe for disaster. And I can only say that there may be some good things in here, but as a whole, this is going to add even more confusion to our already confusing administration. We can do better than this. We can do better with better communication, not just between the chairman and the administrator, but between the chairman, the administrator, and the board. Thank you.
A point of information that I think is important to the spirit of this conversation. Last June, we had a discussion and did a major overhaul to the ordinance. One of the things that I think is worth noting is Carla's list of duties, or a department head's list of duties, can be delegated down. It can be at any time. One of the things that was told to me by legal last summer when we did this major overhaul of our ordinance was that any duties that are delegated that you have or are beneath you, you can engage on as you see fit as the person in the direct line of reporting. What has changed now, and that's what was told to me in June, and why I was okay with a major overhaul to the ordinance, but now that we've moved the chairman over and I'm not technically part of the organization chart, it makes it hard to engage when I would deem it appropriate. That said, Carla, as the person with a list of duties, could certainly do that with her subordinates. And I'm going to come back a second time. A quick follow-up, and then we'll move on to our next person.
Thank you. To clarify, Mr. Chairman, we have three positions, three C-level positions that are now all being held by a single person, whereas in previous administrations, in previous years, we had the proper staffing to be able to manage that. We don't now, and we're consolidating even more roles and duties under a single person. That's where I find this troublesome.
Thank you, Mr. Fellers. The next hand up, I believe, was Mrs. Crosby.
I emailed you, Mr. Fiducia, some questions on the 18th that I received no response, and I sent another email, copied you yesterday, which I have received no response. But one question I do have, who does the performance evaluations on the administrator, either semi-annually or annually? How does that logistically work out?
Well, let's ask Carla, or let's ask the staff when they did the last report. Who did they do it? Carla?
All of my departments have had an annual evaluation by the end of December. I've never been evaluated.
Okay, so the same question, who would evaluate the performance? I mean, where's our gauge on this? How do we know things are getting done the way they should? Work is getting out? I mean, there has to be some kind of measurement here.
I agree with you. I agree with you with measurement. But what I also see is I see that personnel and policies would see discrepancies, and if they found discrepancies, they bring it towards the full board.
So the policies and procedures will do the evaluation on the administrator. Is that what you're telling me?
I would imagine any committee that would see a problem with the administrator would bring it forward.
So all 20 of us would have the power to bring it forward?
I would think that, but I'm not. I'd have to maybe refer to legal.
I just want an answer. I mean, is it all 20? Is it policies and procedures? You've given me 3 answers here. Which one's correct?
What I'm hearing is that that would be something that would have to be clarified going forward. Is that an accurate statement?
That's correct. I would try to refer that to legal, but I think it could be clarified and adjusted.
Because it hasn't been clarified by legal, when would it be clarified by legal, and what would legal say?
I'm under the impression that this ordinance did go through the state's attorney's office. Our legal looked at it before, and
but Dave, you just said you would have to go to legal.
It would if you. What you're saying is the point you brought up. Yeah, it would have to go to. We'd want to bring it back to legal and look at it, but that doesn't say right now, we're not, doing the right thing.
Okay, I have another follow-up for our state's attorney. I know I emailed you yesterday and you didn't have a lot of time to respond, so I'm very respectful of that. But I did get a contact from an attorney that was dynamically concerned that we're ignoring the voter, and his term was that we're violating the public trust. Because
Mr. Webster.
Would say you're going down hearsay now. That has no part of it. In fact, the earlier part there when Mr. Booker read something from someone, same way, Judge Rudy would say hearsay. That person is not here to back that up. Anyone could tell you something, anyone could write something.
Mr. Webster, I'm going to stop you right there. I'm okay with the question. I'm okay with the question going to the state's attorney, and it was a question asked of the state's attorney, and hearing their opinion on this matter would seem appropriate to me, but I understand your concern, sir.
Mrs. here to respond.
Mr.
This
Webster,
independent attorney
you do not have the
that she's
floor.
talking about is not here.
Mr. Webster, you do not have the floor. I'm going to give the floor to the state's attorney and let them respond to her direct question, and then let them handle the response, not me or you. Mr. Kurlinkus.
Put my mic on. Is it on? Okay, first of all, by Illinois Constitution and by statute, the state's attorney for Winnebago County is the attorney for the county board, so I will not respond to any outside attorney providing legal guidance to county board members. It is improper and it is unconstitutional.
Thank you very much to the state's attorney. Mrs. Crosby, that was your final question, correct? Okay, I think I had Mr. Webster's hand was up next, and then Mr. Tassoni. Mr. Webster.
Yield my current time here to my caucus chair.
Mr. Boomer.
Just to answer a little bit of Mrs. Crosby's questions, they were presented. I know she wasn't there because she did email me or text me. I thought we emailed it to her, but everybody that came to the meeting that we talked about this whole ordinance got her answers and her questions answered. I don't have them with me right now. Does anybody have them with them? But they were there. So, I mean, if somebody would have called us prior to it, she could have got them. Mr. Booker wasn't there, so obviously he didn't get them. Mr. Arena was there, and 13 other people were there. So, I don't know. And then the question of, when you're trying to ask Dave something that's not in the ordinance, how can he answer the question that it's not even in the ordinance? That's what I'm saying.
Thank you, Mr. Boomer. And I'm going to Mr. Tassoni. Thank you, Mr. Boomer, very much. I'll go to Mr. Tassoni. Just a point for the record, I was at the Personnel and Policy meeting. I did not receive that either, and I did request information from Mr. Fiducia multiple times. Mr. Tassoni.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to direct my question to Ms. Crosby. Would you please disclose the attorney that gave you that information?
Howski.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tassoni. Thank you, Mr. Tassoni. The next hand up was Mr. Salgado. I apologize, Mr. Westcott. I'll come to you next. I apologize.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple things. This is kind of getting out of hand from my perspective. We're talking about the chairman's responsibilities. We're not talking about the county administrator. We're not talking about the CEO, the CFO. I think we're really talking about the chairman's roles and responsibility. Now, those are all hypotheticals. Well, who does Carla now report, whatever the case may be, relinquish the duties? I think we need to stick to the facts. It's unfair. I gotta say, I can say the same thing. The chairman has had the county administrator, Amanda Haymaker, left. Julia Halstead has left. So, I mean, to that credit, where are the fill-ins for those positions? I could account that, but I'm not going to get into it. So let's stick to the chairman's roles and responsibility. Those are all hypotheticals. You're right, we can put them in policy, we can change up the county administrator, we can change the CFO's roles and responsibility to make sure we have internal controls, all that in place. I get that 100%. No one's arguing that. Here we're talking about the chairman's roles and responsibility. Back to Mr. Haney's comments about elections and that I was elected, so was I. Everybody has a responsibility. So if I make the wrong decision here and I don't get elected, it's because the people voted me in. Unfortunately, there's people out there that I talk to after we have conversations, because we hear about the media, things that are going on and are being misconstrued, that we're dysfunctional, whatever, and I've had this discussion and I've gone on this rant over and over. But at the end of the day, I have people calling me, and they respect what I have to say, and they understand an appreciation of what we're doing. So let's you know, I go back to the percentage of being elected. Yes, I was elected. So if I'm making the wrong decisions or moving the county in the wrong direction, guess what? I'm going to get booted out. Same thing with Mr. Haney. If things are going the wrong way, I hope the citizens will vote the wrong way. But if he's doing an awesome job in the community and pushing things going the right direction, they're going to vote for him regardless. We can have a referendum. We can do what we do with Wisconsin, the recall of governors, whatever. We can push that as a referendum. Yes, we can. We can do all those things. Where has the referendum come in place? We haven't done it. It's all talk. It's all semantics. Now, they say we have a political agenda. I don't think we have a political agenda to attack Mr. Haney or any other individual in this organization when we're having the majority of voting in the right direction or one way or the other. I don't think that we have a political agenda. I don't, personally. I don't have a political agenda. What I want is the best for the Winnebago County and the direction. If I see dysfunction in an organization, which is the board office, I have the right to speak up and to request changes to the ordinance. Now, we talk about that we have 9, 10 different changes. That's our right. We can do so. That is in the ordinance. We have the right to do so. To say that, oh, we have 9 or 10 is irresponsible and that we're just changing the duties of the chairman. If things aren't working, we need to change things. That's our process. That's what we're here. We're here to set policy and procedure. We're not here to micromanage the county. That is not our job. Our job is to set policy and procedure. So let's stick to the chairman, roles and responsibility. If we want to bring another resolution or ordinance of changing the county administrator's roles and responsibility, we can do so. We can do it with the CFO, any other officers that are out there. So let's just stick to that, because I hear there are all these hypotheticals. Well, what's going to happen? Carla has all the power now. Who's going to manage this? We can talk about those things. Let's stick to the chairman's role and stick to this ordinance that we're talking about. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Salgado. Any other questions? Mr. Hoffman. Sorry, I apologize I missed you. That was not intentional.
Thank you, Chairman. I just wanted to bring up a couple things that I want to go on with Mr. Salgado, but a couple things Ms. Crosby brought up. Has she been, what was the word, review, or what would you ask about Carla? Been evaluated, performance evaluation, and she said no. But then she said, how are we going to, well, it wasn't done when the chairman had for 2 years. So why are we worried about the next 2 years so much if it hasn't been done for the first 2 years? And we can do a performance evaluation. The other thing I would like to know is why, this is a legal question, why was one person allowed to literally play a cheap man's Clarence Darrow and ask a series of 20 questions? And no, I've never seen that happen on the board floor before, where one member gets to literally just depose a person up there. Why was that allowed to happen?
I allowed the follow-up questions, yes, Mr. Hoffman.
And would you allow that of everybody?
I have not shut down questions at this point.
Because nobody's asked 30 questions in a row.
Understood. Thank you, Mr. Hoffman. Point made. Thank you very much. Any other discussion or questions? Mr. Webster.
Yeah, a follow-up on Joe. As far as the performance evaluation, you're correct. No one's asked of a performance evaluation from our administrator. As far as I know, the chairman hasn't asked one of her. We haven't asked one of her. We haven't asked one of the chairman. Have anybody asked one for of the chairman the past 2 years? No. And so I think that could be on an as-needed basis. And yes, I think it should correctly go through policy and procedures if that's the game we're going to play here, okay? And lastly, I think this will be lastly, so much has been made or tried to be blown up or made an issue out of, well, who wrote this? Did you write this? Did you write that? It does not matter who the author is. You're not voting on the author. You're voting on the ordinance. Could have been written by Santa Claus. Who cares? What you're voting on is what's right in front of you right now, not the author of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and just a point of information. Thank you, Mr. Webster. A point of information. Carla became hired as a CFO, and about a year later became the county administrator. At about the 1-year mark, we sat and talked in pretty good detail about the future. And there were follow-up discussions with a couple of county board members, one past, one current, related to the future in that position. It was a good, productive discussion. Just to be clear, there was very specific discussions. So we're clear for the record. Follow-ups, and I'm sorry, I think Mr. Neighbors is next. I missed him a couple of times. Mr. Neighbors.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With the whole ordinance, I'm just, please forgive me for being green and new to, politics and committee, but I just want to look at how this affects the county's future as a whole, because if we restrict the chairman's duty now, right now it looks like we just have we just want an economic development professional in the chairman's seat. So if we take away financial management and personnel concerns, that for one ties its hands with economic development, and two, in the future, if we get another, when the economy is greater in Winnebago County, and we don't need to stress economic development as much, and we need to stress financial management more, where does that leave the chairman, and why would we have a chairman in that spot if we need less economic development and more financial management? I'm just looking for why is this important, or how will it affect the future of Winnebago County? And I just look at it and say we're going backwards for the future of Winnebago County if we change this right now.
Was that and just to clarify, Mr. Neighbors, was that a statement and or a question to me?
A statement.
Okay, thank you.
The whole ordinance is going backwards for the county of Winnebago, in my opinion.
Thank you. And just a point of information before I go to Mrs. Gorel and then Mr. Salgado on the follow-up. Point of information, the last June when we looked at the entire ordinance, we looked at the entire Chapter 2, which is many sections, and we talked about how it interacted with one another. And I do appreciate Mr. Salgado's point about staying on task on the item before us. What I would say was easier then, and it's harder now, is we had those discussions at that time about, well, if you move something here, how does it affect here? And I felt like we had a more comprehensive discussion internally with legal, in committee, and as needed. By the time we got to the board floor, a lot of that was taken care of. I think some of the resulting confusion, and when I read a board member say that there's double talk in the ordinance after we pass it on January 24th, it's because we looked at it in chunks. That's just my opinion, but I wanted to share that. Mrs. Gorel.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to let Mr. Salgado go first.
Mr. Salgado on a follow-up.
Yeah, I just want to counter what you said, that we sat down. I was one of those county board members. Ted Biondo was the other one. Carla was the other. Mr. Kalinkas was in the room. I explicitly told you, and I will go back to this. I said you need to set your organizational structure so there is no chaos going into the board. We had those discussions. Now, you brought it up. I'm just saying it. I'm just responding, so it's on record. That's what I told you. You need to have your structure and organization with roles and responsibilities for each of the people that are currently an officer. Like Carla was both county administrator, CFO. There was talks about bringing a COO at the time. It has not happened, has not done. So when that board is at that lean, something has to happen. Things aren't happening. Things are not being communicated down the line. We voted on things that, you may say it's an attack on your personality or your agenda. That is not the case. We're going in the right direction. We're pushing things. So that I just want to address that point, because you brought up something that is untrue, and I'm just stating the fact there. The other thing is to answer to Mr. Neighbors. We passed an ordinance back in January, right? There was discussion about what's the role and responsibility of the chairman, because I have no direction. I feel like I have no power. I have no say, no voice or anything. This is what this ordinance is doing. It's defining the role. Now, you may not like it because it's been stripped away or things have been taken out. Well, that's what we voted on January back then at the beginning. So this is just defining the situation. So there's roles and responsibilities. So then he can gauge and feel more that what his roles and responsibility are. That's what we're doing right now. But this was already passed, you know, that he was, now the county administrator was reporting directly to us. Now, the county chairman had concerns about what is my role and responsibility. This is the attempt of doing so, and that's what we need to focus on. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Salgado. Follow-up, Mrs. Grohl.
Thank you, Chairman. We keep getting away from the main subject. We need to get back on the chairman, and I'm going to call the question right now. Let's get this over with. Too much talking.
So I'll take that as a motion by Mrs. Grohl to call the question.
Yes.
I need a second. I have a second by Mr. Westcott, Mr. Hoffman. The item before the board is to call the question. Any comments on calling the question? Seeing none, I will ask the clerk to call the roll on calling the question. A yes would call the question. It is not voting on the ordinance. A no would decline the calling of the question, and debate and discussion would continue. Thank you.
Calling the question. Mr. Salgado? Yes. Mr. Schultz? Yes. Mr. Tassoni? Yes. Mr. Webster? Yes. Mr. Westcott? Yes. Mr. Arena? Yes. Mr. Billich? Yes. Mr. Boomer? Yes. Mr. Booker? Yes. Mr. Butita? Yes. Mrs. Crosby? No. Mr. Fellers? No. Mr. Fiducia?
Yes.
Mr. Gurl? Yes. Mrs. Gurl? Yes. Mr. Hoffman? Yes. Mr. Kelly? No. Mr. McDonald? Yes. Mr. Neighbors? Yes. Mrs. Red? Yes. 17 yes, 3-0.
Motion passes. We've called the question. That would allow us to immediately turn around and take the vote. The amended ordinance, which includes Mr. Gurl's amended ordinance related to economic development, is before the board for action. A yes vote would pass, a no vote would decline. And with that, I would ask the clerk to call the roll.
Can you clarify the question one more time?
Yes, the item before the board is the amended ordinance that we're taking action on. It includes Mr. Gurl's economic development amendment that the board adopted. So the item before the board, the item before the board is the amended ordinance. A yes vote would pass the amended ordinance. A no vote would decline it.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman,
yes, Mr. Fiducia.
That would also include that spelling snafu you pointed out?
Yes.
Okay.
We had two amendments. Thank you, Mr. Fiducia. The administrative language change and also Mr. Gurl's economic development change. Thank you very much for that clarification. With that, I'll ask the clerk to call the roll.
Mr. Schultz? Yes. Mr. Tassoni? Yes. Mr. Webster? Yes. Mr. Westcott? Yes. Mr. Arena? No. Mr. Billich? Yes. Mr. Boomer? Yes. Mr. Booker? No. Mr. Butita? Mrs. Crosby? No. Mr. Fellers? No. Mr. Fiducia?
Yes.
Mr. Gurl? Yes. Mrs. Gorel? Yes. Mr. Hoffman? Yes. Mr. Kelly? No. Mr. McDonald? Yes. Mr. Neighbors? No. Mrs. Rudd? Yes. Mr. Salgado? Yes. 7 noes, 13 yeas. Motion passes.
Motion passes. Thank you very much for the discussion. Next item of business would be the resolution awarding, oh, I'm sorry, I'll go back to Mr. Fiducia. Mr. Fiducia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our next item is a resolution awarding the on-site wellness clinic services to Swedish American Health Systems. Let me say this about that we're just going to save money on this. We're going to get the possibility of using our north location too, and restructured hours. I think that the purchasing and the administration did a wonderful job in vetting this out, and I urge its approval.
So we have a motion, before we discuss this, a motion by Mr. Feller, or excuse me, Mr. Fiducia on the wellness clinic, awarding the on-site wellness clinic services. Can I have a second, please, by board members? I got Mrs. Gorel and Mrs. Red on the second. So the item before the board is the awarding of on-site wellness services. Given that this is a major vote for the board, could we get like a quick 2-minute overview from either Carla, Ann, or whoever the appropriate person is?
I would like Debbie to speak to this.
Thank you. Debbie?
Thank you. I believe you have this sheet that was handed out prior to the meeting. This is a list of the value-added services that are being brought to us by Swedish American Hospital. Swedish American initially submitted an annual cost to us of $323,242. They came back then and reduced that amount to $319,764. There were 2 other vendors that we had in for interviews. They ranged from $529,000 to $587,000. The Swedish American rates are good for 2 years. Thereafter, it's CPI for 3 years. Swedes has committed to contributing an estimated $80,000 to us for capital expenditures of the clinic. They will be utilizing staffing from one of their current wellness centers. They're going to utilize their internal lab service, which eliminates the need and the cost for a third-party lab. 2 patient rooms will be utilized. The health risk assessments that our employees go through annually every year are quoted in that price. As was referenced, there's a possibility that we could have access to a north end location in the future. We are expanding services to include newborn to age 12. That is a big service that we're going to be offering. Swedish American recommends forming an advisory committee of Swedish American staff to work with Winnebago County Wellness Committee. They have local clients that they're currently working with that would include Woodward, Boone County, and Forest City Gear. And they will utilize the Epic medical records system at no additional cost.
Thank you very much. Any questions? There is a kind of a cheat sheet for board members on your desk in front of you. I do see a couple hands up. I'll go to Mr. Fellers first. Okay, Mr. Fellers.
Yeah, it seems a few board members have decided to leave. Do we need to take a 5-minute recess so we're all here to vote?
I think we're going to be coming back. I think we're okay. We have a quorum, so we're okay at this point. I don't know who left for good and who's in the restroom, so I think we'll proceed because we have a quorum at this point. But thank you. Any other questions or comments on the wellness services? Seeing none, since it's a resolution, we can do a voice vote. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Are there any opposed? We have all are in favor. There are 0 opposed. We have Mr. Webster, Mr. Westcott were absent for the vote, so they will be marked as such. And Mr. McDonald was absent for the vote. Mr. Webster, Mr. Westcott, and Mr. McDonald were absent for the vote.
Mr. Boomer?
Mr. Boomer was here and voted yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Motion passes. Mr. Fiducia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and that concludes my report.
Thank you very much. Next item of business, Finance Committee, Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Finance Committee has 2 items today. One is the budget amendment, 2019-20, the Sheriff's Grant Fund for the State Criminal Alien Assistance Program Grant, SCAAP. This is to be laid over.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to motion to suspend the rules and vote on this today.
We got a motion by Mr. Salgado on Budget Amendment 2019-020, the Sheriff's Grant Fund for State Criminal Alien Assistance Program Grant. A motion to suspend the rules. If we suspend, we can vote this evening. Can I have a second on suspending the rules? Mr. Hoffman and Mr. Gurl, Mr. Billick. The item, the motion to suspend is now before the board. Any questions on suspending the rules? A yes vote would allow us to suspend. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Are there any opposed to suspending the rules? Seeing none, we have now suspended the rules on a unanimous vote. Thank you, Mr. Salgado.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I would like to move to approve Budget Amendment 2019-020, Sheriff's Grant Fund, to be approved.
We got a motion by Mr. Salgado on Budget Amendment 2019-020, Sheriff's Grant Fund. May I have a second? Mr. Hoffman. Item is now before the board for action. Any discussion on this item?
I can speak to it.
Yes, sir.
Pretty much it's a margin neutral grant that they got. Upon receipt, the grants, the county pays Justice Benefit Systems for services provide gathering statistical information to submit to the grant application. The remainder of the proceeds will be transferred to the general fund for the corrections salaries. So that's pretty much what this grant is intended for.
Thank you very much, Mr. Salgado. Any questions or comments by board members? Seeing none, are there any board members opposed to this motion? Please raise your hand. Seeing none, we're going to cast a yes vote for all members present. And we'll note that Mr. Boomer and Mr. Fiducia were absent for the vote. Yes to all other members present. Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The next item is Budget Amendment 2019-021, Health Department Drug Overdose Prevention Services Grant, to be laid over.
Good. Thank you for reading that in, Mr. Salgado.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I would also like to move to suspend the rules and vote on this today.
Thank you. We got a motion by Mr. Salgado to suspend the rules on Budget Amendment 2019-021, the Health Department Drug Overdose Prevention Services Grant. May I have a second on the motion to suspend? Mr. Hoffman, Mrs. Gorel. Motion to suspend is now before the board. Any questions by board members before we take the vote to suspend or not? Seeing none, all in favor of suspending the rules signify by saying aye. Any opposed? We've suspended the rules. Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to move to approve Budget Amendment 2019-021, the Health Department Drug Overdose Prevention Services Grant.
We got a motion by Mr. Salgado on Budget Amendment 2019-021, Health Department Drug Overdose Grant. May I have a second on Mr. Salgado's motion? A second by Mr. Booker, Mrs. Gorel, and Mrs. Red. Any discussion by board members? Seeing none, are there any board members opposed to this motion? Please raise your hand. Seeing none, I'm going to cast a yes vote for all board members present, and we will note that Mr. Boomer and Mr. Fiducia are absent. Motion passes. Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That concludes our report. Thank you.
Thank you. Next item of business, Zoning Committee, Mr. Webster.
Thank you.
Thank you. Zoning Committee has but one item on our agenda this evening, and it's to be read in for layover, Z1718. It's a map amendment to rezone plus or minus 3.3 acres. And that will lay over to our next county board meeting.
Thank you.
Then our next zoning board of appeals meeting, our next zoning committee meeting is April the 24th. And if I may, I'd like to mention that you all saw an email there that Soil and Water Conservation District was going to do a presentation. And unfortunately, she got ill that day, so we're going to have to reschedule that. Mr. Salgado suggested that perhaps we could do it here at before a county board meeting, if board members were okay with that, and then if the chairman was okay with putting it on the agenda.
Absolutely.
Okay, we'll try to make it brief. I think it'll be a PowerPoint.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
Happy to do it. Thank you very much, Mr. Webster. Next item of business, Economic Development Committee, Mr. Westcott.
Thank you, Chairman. We have one item in front of us tonight. It's a resolution granting authority to the Winnebago County Board Chairman to execute the documents necessary to complete a loan for $30,000 from the revolving loan fund to Apollo Enterprises LLC, and I so move.
We got a motion by Mr. Westcott on the resolution granting authority of the Winnebago County Board Chairman to execute documents necessary to complete a loan for $30,000 to the revolving loan fund to Apollo Enterprises LLC. May I have a second to Mr. Westcott's motion? Mr. Neighbors, Mrs. Gorel, and Mrs. Red. Item is now before the board. Any questions or comments for board members? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Are there any opposed? Motion passes. Thank you very much. Mr. Westcott.
Thank you, Chairman. That concludes my report, but we will be having a meeting a week from tonight.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Westcott. Next item of business is the Operations Administrative Committee. Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Operations Committee tonight has a resolution for telecommunication services contract renewal, and I move for its approval.
Yes, we have a motion by Mr. McDonald on a resolution for telecommunication services contract renewal. May I have a second? Mr. Webster, Mrs. Red, Mr. Salgado. Item is now before the board. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Are there any opposed? Motion passes. Thank you very much, Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Item number 3 is resolution adopting 5 shared organizational values for Winnebago County, and I move for its approval.
We got a motion by Mr. McDonald on the resolution adopting the 5 shared organizational values for Winnebago County. I have a second by Mrs. Red, Mr. Salgado, Mrs. Crosby. Item is now before the board for discussion. Any questions or comments by board members? Seeing no hands up, we'll take the vote. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Are there any opposed? Motion passes unanimously with a couple absent. Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Item 4 is resolution adopting the 5 strategic priority areas for Winnebago County, and I move its approval.
We got a resolution, a motion by Mr. McDonald on a resolution adopting 5 strategic priority areas for Winnebago County. May I have a second? Mr. Hoffman, thank you. Mr. Salgado, Mrs. Red. Item is now before the board. Any discussion by board members? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Any opposed? Motion passes. Thank you very much. Mr. McDonald.
The last item for this evening, sir, is an ordinance amending sections of Chapter 62 of the County Code of Ordinances, the vehicle policy, to be laid over.
Thank you. You've read that in.
That concludes my report. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, Mr. Fellers. Mr.
Thank you.
Fellers.
Can we get a red line document of the changes sent around? I've only ever received just what the changes are. Thank you.
We'll get that. Carla?
We opened it up where previously only county employees could be in vehicles. Now we've expanded that to employees of other local governments, as well as those that are detained by the county. We took out the name of the towing company and just referred to the county-appointed towing company, and then we added language in the discipline section stating that the union language would take priority over the county policy.
Thank you. Thank you, Carla. Thank you, Mr. Fellers. And thank you, Mr. McDonald. Mr. Tassoni, Public Works Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just for information for the board, before I start our resolutions agendas here, we did make a commitment to move our Public Works Committee meetings to the Tuesday prior to the week of the board, so that there's time for information to get to the respective caucuses and discussion and answer period. This will be the last stack of resolutions that come to you as they have been, unless some emergency situation dictates otherwise.
Thank you, Mr. Tassoni.
First item on the agenda is 19-001, and it is the resolution authorizing the obligation of the retirement of the bond payments of MFT funds. Yeah, I so move.
We have a motion by Mr. Tassoni and the resolution authorizing obligation retirement of bond payments for MFT funds. May I have a second?
Yes, I'm sorry.
We have a motion by Mr. Tassoni, a second by Mr. Fellers and Mr. Gurl. Item is now before the board. Would you like to speak to that, Mr. Tassoni?
This is just our annual housekeeping here, 1.4 million, 1.45 million cost to the county, and 1.4 by way of federal.
Thank you very much. Any questions by board members on this item? Seeing none, we'll go ahead and vote. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much, Mr. Tassoni.
Thank you, Chairman. Next item is Resolution 19-002, and it's a resolution authorizing the execution of annual professional services agreements with Strand Associates, Inc. to provide technical services for the maintenance of our water district SCADA system. The cost is $5,000, and it is a budgeted item. I so move.
Motion by Mr. Tassoni on 19-002, the resolution authorizing the execution of annual professional services agreements with Strand Associates to provide technical service for maintenance of the water district's system. May I have a second? Mr. Kelly, thank you. Mr. Hoffman, thank you. Item is now before the board for discussion or questions. Seeing none, we'll take the vote. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Are there any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much, Mr. Tassoni.
Thank you, Chairman. Next item is 19-003. It's a resolution authorizing a supplemental appropriation of MFT funds for the 2018 general maintenance, and it's a cost of $590,000. This is our annual budget authorizing for supplies and services.
Thank you very much. We have a motion by Mr. Tassoni.
I'm sorry, let me back up, Chairman.
Mr. Tassoni.
No, this is $590,000 authorizing the supplemental appropriation of MFT funds for our salt overage.
Thank you.
I so move.
Motion by Mr. Tassoni on 19-003, resolution authorizing supplemental appropriation of MFT funds for the 2018 general maintenance, which would include the salt overage. Mr. Gurl on the second, thank you very much. Item is now before the board for discussion. Any discussion or questions by board members? I see hand up, Mr. Schultz. Mr. Schultz. You hit Mr. Schultz.
Just as a point of clarification, it just seemed odd to me that this is dated 2018 when we just had to do the purchase of salt to provide the additional amount that was needed.
Maybe I'll go to, I'm sorry, Mr. Tassoni on a clarification.
I believe I can clear this up for you, Steve. I believe it comes by way of the 2018 snow and ice control budget, if that's where the funds originated, and if not, if Carlos Molina would speak to it.
Carlos?
Thank you, Mr. Tassoni. Mr. Schultz, this is for the MFT appropriation of 2018 MFT funds, because we went over of what was appropriated about a year ago. Then we need these funds to be able to use MFT funds to pay for that additional salt.
I'm going to trust you on that. It's still confusing to me, but we can move on.
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you, Mr. Schultz. Mr. Tassoni, anything you want to add?
It just 2018-19 budget. If it was a year from now, it'd be 2019-20 for, winter overlaps those two seasons, or those dates. And if I didn't move, I so move.
Okay. Now we got the motion and second. It is before the board for action on the salt overage resolution. Any other discussion or questions by board members before we take the vote? It is 19-003. Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes. Thank you very much. Mr. Tassoni.
Thank you, Chairman. Next item is 19-004. It's a resolution declaring a surplus of highway department vehicles and equipment and authorizing the sale. And basically, this allows the highway department to list some old rusted iron and some other various things that are no longer needed, and maybe others as well, but to be able to relinquish them and replace with newer ones. I so move.
Motion by Mr. Tassoni on 19-004, resolution declaring as a surplus highway department vehicles and equipment and authorizing sale. Second by Mr. Webster, Mr. Kelly, and Mr. Gurl. Item is now before the board. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much, Mr. Tassoni.
Next item, thank you, Chairman. Next item is 19-005. It's a resolution authorizing the award of a bid for an excavator at a cost of $69,687 and some change. And basically, this is to replace an aging excavator, rubber tire excavator, and in lieu of they're trading in that vehicle, and the total purchase cost was $106,000. So trade in, and then our cost for a newer model is $69,000. I so move.
We have a motion by Mr. Tassoni on 19-005, resolution authorizing the award of bid of a bid for an excavator. May I have a second? Mr. Webster on the second item is now before the board. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Go back to Mr. Tassoni.
Thank you, Chairman. Next item is 19-006. It's a resolution authorizing the award of bids for the 2019 general letting. The bids were distributed at our Public Works the other night, and I so move.
We have a motion by Mr. Tassoni on 19-006, resolution authorizing the award of bids for the 2019 general letting. May I have a second? Second by Mr. Kelly and Mr. Gurl. Thank you very much. Item is now before the board for discussion or questions. Yes, Mr. Tassoni.
Thank you, Chairman. And I just for those of you who may not be familiar or aware, this resolution just it covers all our services that the county might use: materials, gravel, stone, culvert, piping, miscellaneous, and things they use for general repair and maintenance of our roadways. And the next resolution are the funds to approve those expenditures.
Okay. So the item before the board right now is 19-006, the resolution authorizing the award of bids for 2019 general letting. Any discussion by board members? Yes, Mr. Schultz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just scrambling through the board packet. Do we have that in the board packet?
I'm going to double check that this, if somebody could just take a quick look. I don't recall seeing it, but I didn't look. Is that in the board packet? Yes, sir.
Thank you, Chairman. Steve, I'm not sure. Carlos may speak to it. It might not have made the board packet because the bid opening, and we just received it on Tuesday. Basically, it's bidded materials: stone, gravel, rock, culvert pipe, pretty much things like necessities you would use at your home every day, you know, that you do need. I see there is a, it's right here. This is your packet, though, not a, this is official state's attorney's packet. Is there anything specific you'd like to know, Steve, or, I mean, you've seen it?
Typically, I mean, I guess, unless I'm confused about this, in the past, we've been able to see who the bidders are, and to be able to confirm that we took the low bid. And yes, I'm one of those geeks that goes through and looks at it and makes sure that we're taking the low bid. So I guess I'm going to go with the assumption that we did take the low bid, but in the future, I would like to see that information.
Carlos, can I go to you on just a clarification on, I think, Mr. Schultz's valid question?
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do not know whether it is in your packet or not. It should be. However, to answer your questions, we do go with the low bid for all those items, except for materials like aggregate or asphalt, which we base that on depending on where we're working. So we go with what we call the length of haul. So basically, whichever plant or quarry is closer, that's where we go. So it is awarded to all bidders for those items.
Thank you, Carlos. Mr. Schultz, any follow-up?
Thank you.
No. Thank you, Mr. Schultz. Mr. Fellers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So wait, the bids just went out on Monday. Wait, the bid opening?
Bid opening was Tuesday, I believe.
Okay, Tuesday.
Monday or Tuesday, yes.
So wait, so when will we receive the bids then?
They were opened and received.
Oh, open, I see, open, okay, I got you, okay. Clarification, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fellers. Any other questions by board members? Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Tassoni, then Mr. Salgado.
Mr. Schultz, if we're both still here next year, you'll have the full document of the bids and services a week and a half prior to board.
Thank you, Mr. Tassoni. Mr. Salgado.
Yeah, just to follow up, I think the question Mr. Schultz is asking, has this been awarded? Has the bid been awarded to someone and who that is, or who that person is?
This is probably, I'm just assuming, 20 various suppliers of all kinds of different materials and quantities and services. I mean, just like you go into 5 or 6 different stores for what you need to do a project, this is a whole gamut of things that the county will use throughout the year, and we would have discussed if there was anything that wasn't a low bid that you know, we approved otherwise, but yeah, this.
So there is a list essentially compiled.
Absolutely, and I'm sure the highway department will get that. In lieu of this, I understand we're going to try to pass this tonight, but we'll ask that the highway department to send it to all board members as soon as tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Salgado. I got Mr. McDonald, then I think Mr. Kelly had something he wanted to add as well. Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just out of curiosity, is there anything time sensitive tonight to this? You know, could we lay it over so that we can have all the documents and vote on it at the next meeting?
Well, I understand your concern. I assume I understand anyone's concern that's not on the Public Works Committee. This is what we do every year, and it's, Carlos, correct me if I'm wrong, there's nothing different other than typical percentage of increase as cost of living. That's the document it is.
What I think I can share with Mr. Schultz, I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but it says cost to be determined, and it would feel better to have a cost prior to.
No, to be disclosed, and that was Tuesday
Either
night.
way, we still don't know. I would be more comfortable to have some idea what we're looking at.
So, very clear, just to be very clear on the floor, Mr. McDonald, as a board member, you can make a motion to lay this over. Any board member can. If you would like to make a motion, you're welcome to do so.
And I'm inclined to if it's not going to cause a disruption with the highway department.
Mr. Tassoni.
Thank you. I would ask Mr. Molina, if this is time sensitive, is there anything there you're going to have to buy in a week?
Carlos.
If the general letting, general maintenance for each year starts for us, it starts on April 1st. So what will happen is if we delayed it that between now and the time that you approve it, we won't be able to purchase any of these services, traffic barricades, stone, asphalt, things like that.
No motion.
No motion by Mr. McDonald. Thank you, Carlos, for the clarification. And then I'm still trying to get to Mr. Kelly, but I'm going to defer to the chair of the committee.
Thank you, Chairman. And as I had said before, you've already approved the bids. This is the money appropriating the expenditure.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Kelly.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that the bids, it's just unit prices. We don't know how much of it we're going to buy. And a lot of times, where you buy depends on how close you are, you know. If you're next to Menards, you might buy at Menards. If you're closer to Home Depot, you might go there. Well, we do the same thing with gravel, sand, blacktop, stuff like that. And so that, you know, it's just to make available everything for the year, but we don't know how much we're actually going to use. So the bids were just unit prices.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Any other comments, Mr. Tassoni? Any other comments on the board floor? Okay, all those in favor, and of course, it is 19006, 2019 general letting. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Are there any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you for the conversation, Mr. Tassoni.
We were on 6.
Oops, excuse me, let me back up and clarification for, yes, 19006.
Okay, then.
We have one more, Mr. Tassoni.
Excuse me, then, my correction that we had already passed them bids, because spent a lot of time up here. Next item is 19-007, and this is the resolution that it's a resolution authorizing the appropriation of the MFT funds to pay for the goods and services that we just accepted the bid on, and I so move.
Got a motion by Mr. Tassoni on 19007, resolution authorizing the appropriation of MFT funds for the maintenance of county highways. May I have a second, please? Mr. Gurl, thank you. Item is now before the board. Any discussion? Yes, Mr. Arena.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I just want to make sure I understand. Mr. Kelly said that the bids were approving unit prices. So how do we come up with this dollar amount? Am I understanding the connection here?
I would base it on that typically this is what we spend every year for the past however many years, and this is probably has some kind of percentage of increase based on inflation.
So
and
it's an estimate.
Mr. Molino wants to speak further to that.
Carlos, is that like a not-to-exceed number? Meaning, no, okay, go ahead, Carlos.
Mr. Chairman, no, what this is, what you approved prior to this was the actual bid. You have to come up with some estimates. The estimate for the materials is about $1.4 million when you add all those bidders. The 5.1 includes all the labor, including county labor. So when our guys are out there patching potholes, we can charge it to MFT funds. It includes equipment, including salt for next year, for next winter. All that is estimated in this $5.1 million so that we can use MFT funds to provide all the services.
Okay, so this number might change, right?
If it does change, then we will have to come back to you for a supplemental, just like we did for salt a couple of resolutions ago.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you, Mr. Arena. Mrs. Grohl.
Thank you, Chairman. Can I actually assume this is your budget for the year? Would that be a better way of explaining this?
It might be a budget for the particular items, but not in whole. Carlos, do you have anything to add?
This is what it would be, the budget, I guess, for MFT funds, but in our budget, we also have county bridge, county highway, federal aid match.
Yes, a follow-up, Mrs. Grohl.
But this is basically the materials you use every day.
Carlos.
Yes, it is, plus labor and equipment.
So it is this is a budgeted item.
For that fund.
For that fund. Thank you.
Yes, just to be clear. Yes, thank you, Mrs. Grohl. Any other questions by board members on 19007? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Mr. Tassoni.
Thank you, Chairman.
Marathon report. Nice job. Thank you. Next item of business. Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Webster.
Thank you. As long as we got Carlos on the spot here, the conference I went to recently, there was another speaker there. It was actually the new director of the Department of Transportation, the new secretary of the Department of Transportation, and he mentioned there that in past years, I can't remember how he described it exactly, maybe Carlos could help me, but in past years, the state every year in the spring has released a bunch of money to fix, emergency money to fix state roads as far as all these potholes and things go. And of course, that's for state roads, but is there, do we have emergency money we release, Carlos, or how is our road patching going,
Thanks, Mr. Webster. Yeah, you said it. That's for state roads. And the only thing that I can think of is that maybe they are also over on salt. Everybody is, and that's why they are not releasing some of those funds for patching. As far as we're concerned, we are patching potholes as well as we can with the budget items that we have.
Yeah, well, he expressed there that there was no money for it this year, and so he kind of hinted that you can expect to see some pretty crappy roads, state roads there, at least until they get a capital plan going there that budgets money for the highways. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Webster. Next item of business, Public Safety Committee. Mr. Booker.
Thank you, Chairman. Public Safety Committee has no report. Our next Public Safety Committee meeting is for a week from tonight, April 4th. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Booker. Any unfinished business by board members? Seeing none, under new business, we have two appointments to read in for first reading. It's actually appointment. It's official appointment. Mr. Booker was verbally added to the Extension Board, but like Mrs. Gorel and like Mr. Webster, who are officially board appointed and have been members for probably some time now, we talked publicly about adding Mr. Booker to this board as the third spot. We never officially ran it through the board. We'd like to make that official. That's one we're reading in tonight. Second, the appointment of Danielle Potter to the Winnebago County Housing Authority Board. This was at the strong recommendation of their executive director, Alan Zeiss. Obviously, Mr. Westcott serves as the president of the board. I forwarded to him. I assume by his silence he was okay with it. I see his head was nodding up and down. I think both are great nominees for two different important boards. So that's being read in tonight for first reading. Yes, Mrs. Gorel.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to suspend the rules on this. First of all, Mr. Booker doesn't know it, but on April 4th, that evening, we have a meeting for the extension, and we'll be in Stevenson County. So it would be nice if you could change that night so you could be part of that and get introduced to the extension. Second of all, I think it's great that Mr. Booker is in on this because he represents the south of our county. Mr. Webster represents the north of the county, and I'm the city. So we got you all covered. Thank you.
Three-headed monster. Thank you, Mrs. Gorel. Any other? So we got a motion by Mrs. Gorel to suspend the rules is her motion. Can I have a second on suspending the rules? And let me be clear, my understanding of your motion is to suspend the rules on both 1 and 2, Mr. Booker and Mrs. Potter. The motion is to suspend the rules, which would allow us to take action on both appointment recommendations. I got a second by Mr. Fellers, and I think I saw a second hand up, Mrs. Redd and Mr. Salgado. The motion to suspend is before the board. Any discussion on either item? They can be split out, by the way, if people want to ever vote separately. Seeing none, all those in favor of suspending the rules and voting on both those appointments tonight signify by saying aye. Are there any opposed? Motion passes. We've suspended the rules. I would entertain a motion to approve both Aaron Booker to the University of Illinois Extension Board, Danielle Potter to the Winnebago County Housing Authority. May I have a motion? Motion by Mr. Fellers, a second by Mr. Billick and Mrs. Gorel and Mrs. Redd. I think Mr. Salgado has his hand up. We got a motion and a second on the two appointments. Any discussion on these two appointments? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much. With that, I'd entertain a motion to adjourn. Motion by Mr. Hoffman, a second by Mrs. Gorel. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Any opposed?